G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our April episode of Australia's Biggest Book Club. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that welcome to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us on the webinar today. Australia's Biggest Book Club is once a month, but days and times vary. So head on over to australiainstitute.org.au to find out details of our upcoming events. Next month, we will be talking to acclaimed author and journalist Bree Lee about her new and her debut fiction novel, The Work. So you can check that out on our website. And a couple of tips for Zoom, even though I'm sure you're all dab hands by now. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A box where you can type in questions for Lech today. And you should also be able to upvote questions from other people and leave comments on those questions. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll boot you out. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and it's going to go up on our website later today. So Lech Blaine is joining us today. He's our guest author and author of the memoir Car Crash, the quarterly essay Top Blokes, and obviously this quarterly essay Bad Cop. It's the latest one. It's out in all good bookstores and newsagents at the moment. He is the 2023 Charles Perkins Centre Writer in Residence, and his writing has appeared in Good Weekend, The Griffith Review, The Guardian, and The Monthly. And in this quarterly essay, he's really asking the question, who is Peter Dutton? And looking back at the most recent years in politics and what happened to the Liberal Party. And the essay traces the making of a hardman, from Queensland detective to leader of the opposition. It's an absolute cracking read. So if you haven't got a copy, do yourself a favour and go out and get it now. It's really fantastic. Congratulations on this essay, Lech, and thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, no worries at all. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Look, it's a huge effort, and it always amazes me how people can fit so much into an essay, particularly on a thorny topic like politics where so much happens. But a hugely memorable opening line, Peter Dutton eats bleeding heart lefties for breakfast. What a great place to start the essay. I note he's in the headlines today for a kind of a travel entitlement scandal and also for making some very controversial comments, likening a protest in Sydney to the Port Arthur massacre. He's no stranger to controversy. Can you tell us a little bit about Peter Dutton, the man, I guess?
Yeah, and so this is something that I trace throughout the essay is how Peter Dutton has kind of built a career around making really inflammatory statements around a number of subjects, but going right back to the start of his career. And so there is, as I say, there's a method to the venom, and I try to peel back behind the kind of greatest hits of Peter Dutton's most controversial statements to show the way that they were driven by internal political requirements at the time, and they've allowed him to sort of climb to the top of the Liberal Party. And I guess the challenge for him now is whether the kind of that kind of courting controversy has allowed him to entrench himself at the top of the Liberal Party, but whether it will allow him to reach out across the aisle to people who voted for Labor at the last election. And so that's like the great challenge confronting him. And so I just wanted to go right back through his career and then also through his life, because I think that to understand his psychology is quite important, because he's presents as a fairly dull individual, but he's incredibly interesting and he's incredibly complex. And there's a whole range of social and also personal phenomenon feeding into his political career and also the changes within Australian politics.
Yeah, so I'm just curious to kind of explore some of those formative experiences that kind of shaped him that you do go into. In particular, you know, obviously his time as a Queensland police officer. the title of the essay is Bad Cop. He is kind of the strongman of Australian politics at the moment, taking that kind of pugilistic place of Tony Abbott in the past, I guess. But how much does that background as a police officer inform or has informed his politics from the time he entered Parliament, I guess?
I think, yeah, an incredible amount, in the sense that the comparison's often made with Abbott. And Abbott, although they were very close and they share conservative tendencies, Abbott's background was quite different, in the sense that Abbott is from the North Shore of Sydney. He went to a really prestigious private school, then he went to University of Sydney, then he did a Rhodes Scholarship, then he ended up getting a safe seat on the North Shore in Warringah, which was eventually lost. Whereas Dutton came from a more kind of aspirational background, outer-suburban Brisbane. He didn't do well at university, left university and became a police officer, and had a number of experiences which were quite traumatic, and he started to open up a bit more about them. And then it was also within this culture of the Queensland police force. Like, the police officers have a pretty strong siege mentality. Queensland police officers have even more of a siege mentality. And this was in the aftermath of the Fitzgerald inquiry, and also at the same time as the results of the Royal Commission into Indigenous deaths in custody was happening. So it was a very kind of the siege mentality that you would have as a young police officer in that environment was huge. And I think that Dutton has kind of attributed his contempt for Paul Keating to high interest rates at the end of the 1980s. But at the same time, Keating, at pretty much roughly the same moment that Dutton was entering the police force and was serving in communities in North Queensland and dealing with lots of cases involving Indigenous people, which he has kind of subsequently attributed as the reason why he didn't attend the apology. Keating was making the Redfern speech, and he was speaking openly about, the great Australian silence and the way that racism pervaded the treatment of Indigenous communities, including by the police. So I think that Queensland has a very unique political culture, that it's a bit more conservative. It has like a long history of strongman and even strong women leaders. But then when you add those experiences, when you add personal trauma, when you add the emergence of someone like Pauline Hanson, who was kind of speaking to a lot of those issues, and then Dutton was in the middle of all of that, and I think it explains the level of his contempt for progressives.
Yeah, and that's obviously a theme that carries throughout the essay, and the contempt kind of shows up in a few different ways. There's obviously, like the tweet that anyone who's in or pays attention to politics will know about, you dirty lefties are too easy, or whatever that one was. Then you've got you talk about some of the contempt for the judiciary, and through that lens of, his experiences with the police force, I guess, and that strong theme throughout his political career of law and order, and kind of scapegoating marginalised communities and blaming them for violence and things like that as a political opportunist, like an opportunity. And I guess I just wanted to draw some of those parallels. You were talking about he is often compared to Tony Abbott, but you kind of talk a little bit about the fact that Abbott was far more ideologically driven, and that Peter Dutton is perhaps more practical, but also has this very keen sense of the suburbs and attuned to what suburban people care about. Do you think that kind of sense that he has, will get him through this next electoral period? Obviously, it's been successful for him in the past, but the electoral math has changed quite a bit there. How much is that sense of suburbia going to be important to his role as an opposition leader, I guess?
Yeah, well, he flagged it in his first speech, and there's been a lot of conversation around this idea of the suburban strategy. And And there is an element of opportunity there for the Liberal Party. There is disillusionment during a cost of living crisis in outer suburban communities that feel like that they're disconnected from the political system. I think the issue for Dutton is that he's appealing to an idea of suburbia, which carries more weight, say, in the northern suburbs of Brisbane, which aren't particularly ethnically diverse. And it's an idea of suburbia that hasn't changed that much since Howard was winning elections with outer suburban seats, or also regional seats. And that's those old Howard Battler seats. And there's this idea, and Tony Abbott's someone who has spoken about it, that the Liberal Party should just forget about the seats lost to the Teals, and that their new electoral base is the outer suburbs. And he cites the seat of Lindsay, which is based around Penrith. And that was one of those Howard Battler seats. But if you look at a lot of those other Howard Battler seats, like Macquarie, like Macarthur, like Parramatta, the Central Coast seats, there's a couple there, that they were kind of like those pivotal Howard Battler seats. They've all gone back to Labor. So I think that the idea that those demographics provides like an equal kind of electoral base for the Liberal Party is what Wentworth and Kooyong and those other blue chip Liberal seats. I think it's it's certainly ambitious. And I also think that if you look at a lot of those other outer suburban seats in Sydney and Melbourne, they're very ethnically diverse. There's lots of them are very ethnically diverse. And Dutton himself, but also the Liberal Party, just haven't really made any tangible attempts to connect with them. So I think that there actually would be political opportunities there for a conservative political movement, but the Liberal Party still looks and sounds like the Liberal Party of 2001, but Australia itself and the suburbs as well have changed a lot since Howard was winning those elections and those seats.
Yeah, and I want to, I guess, explore a little bit more, perhaps some of those chickens coming home to roost for Dutton now that his challenge is picking up some of those seats in order to win government, if they are indeed going to concede those Teal kind of seats. And as I kind of referenced before, some of those marginalised communities that he has really gone for as part of either a law and order strategy or just red meat for the base kind of thing. We've got comments like the African gangs in Melbourne, the comments around, that it was a mistake to let in Lebanese Muslims into the country in the 70s. There's a whole litany of those kinds of comments that, as you say, might work for some elements of the Liberal Party base, or for indeed winning kind of more votes back from One Nation and more conservative members of the electorate. But is he really going to have to reckon with those contradictions, or that will be really difficult if that's the path that they're going to pursue at this election? How much of that is going to be a millstone around his neck with those kinds of voters in those kinds of seats?
Well, the thing I would say is that when you interview kind of disengaged voters and even voters who are relatively loyal to the LNP in Queensland, one thing that sticks out is that people don't really know that much about Dutton. So there are there will be issues for him closer to the election when Labor are kind of like targeting specific audiences and communities and replaying those moments. So, but I think that even with the disengaged voters, I think the issue for Dutton is more that the fact that he constantly engages in these kinds of cultural war issues, and I think it conveys, even for people who might sympathise with his views on those issues, it conveys like a lack of seriousness about large scale economic debates, and that's a difference, I think, to someone like Howard, who definitely profited from divisive debates around race, but it was always underpinned by he was able to articulate, even if you didn't agree with it, a really clear economic vision for Australia. I think even disengaged voters realise that Howard was someone who knew what he was talking about when he was talking about economics, and that's because he he was using those other issues to pursue economic reform. That was the main game for him. He was someone who deeply understood Australia's economy and was able to show that, I think, even in debates where he was with hostile audiences. I don't think Dutton does that. I don't think he has the same level of gravitas on economics as what Howard and Costello did. And I think the constant, we saw it at the start of the year, whenever the opportunity arises for like a debate about economic reform, he retreats really quickly into these culture war issues and going back over retreading debates around the voice. And a lot of the people that he's appealing to with that, one of the reasons that they tuned out during the voice is because of the divisive nature of the debate. But he's sort of giving them more and more of that divisiveness. So I think that becomes like a self-defeating cycle, even though it might provide short-term political wins in situations like the voice referendum. Even people who are relatively disengaged from politics, I don't think that he's presenting himself as kind of like someone who's going to be able to address the really serious economic issues facing Australia.
Yeah, we kind of saw him struggle a bit with the response to the government's decision to change the stage 3 tax cuts. And yeah, you kind of talk a little bit about that in here, that there was a fairly consistent message all the way up until the point that, the government decided to make those changes. And then after a few kind of protests, it all just went dead and he just agreed to it. Didn't really have much of an alternative there to talk about. But I do want to kind of talk about him within the Liberal Party and some of the changes that you explore in the essay about, I guess, all the turmoil of leadership and some of those internal struggles that the Liberal Party is facing with a whole bunch of the moderates kind of not being elected at the last election. And I was really curious to read so many. I'd kind of forgotten about George Brandis being kind of his factional opponent over the years. There's lots of great quotes from him in here. But where does Dutton sit within that Liberal Party, I guess, leadership tussle and the kind of Liberal Party that we see today after that last election in terms of all those leadership changes that we had, particularly around that Turnbull era? What were some of the things that stood out to you from that period with Dutton's behaviour?
I think when you talk to his like factional opponents within the Liberal Party, there is an awareness that they see Dutton as kind of like a mainstream conservative, more in the lineage of John Howard. They don't necessarily see him as like a complete fringe figure. So I think that he is someone, and that was one of the really interesting things that Brandis said, was that he actually finds Dutton more ambitious than Tony Abbott. And Tony Abbott is one of the most notoriously ambitious politicians like in modern Australian history. Like he famously either wanted to be Prime Minister or the Pope from quite a young age. So the fact that he saw Dutton as more ambitious and more driven to be the Prime Minister from the moment that he entered Parliament was kind of really telling. And there was this constant, and it's been like talked a lot about with Dutton, and previous profiles have spoken about the way that his private behaviour doesn't really mesh with his public persona. And I thought that was interesting. Like, I don't think that excuses his, the implications of some of his actions and some of the issues and communities that he's targeted. But I found that kind of interesting because it showed that in private, he's seen as like being a really kind of cautious, shy, not someone that's constantly beating the desk and shouting at people. He's seen as like kind of risk averse and being across everything. And then, at particular moments in his political career, he has came out and made really incendiary kind of comments. So it's kind of a contradiction. And I think it goes to this idea that he is quite someone who's quite in control of what he's doing. And whether you agree with his actions or not, he sees those actions as being his path to being the Prime Minister, which is a really single-minded ambition of his. And then within the broader lineage of the Liberal Party, he's really interesting because I think he is the first Liberal leader who probably really comes from that Howard Battler lineage, and a lot of them have subsequent to Howard have spoken about the Battlers and certainly targeted them. But Dutton, his dad was a bricklayer, became a builder, was sort of a proto Howard Battler in a way. And Dutton kind of bristles against the signifiers of elitism that were historically associated with the Liberal Party. Like the Liberal Party was seen as a party of lawyers and doctors, and Dutton is someone who's made a career from beating up on lawyers, and he doesn't tie himself to those kind of signifiers, and so he kind of encapsulates the changes in the Liberal Party that we've certainly seen since someone like Robert Menzies, who was kind of proudly quite pompous and really regularly demonstrated his higher intelligence, and the Liberal Party has it hasn't happened overnight, but it's changed over time, and then we arrive at this moment with someone like Dutton, and he seems to I'm not sure whether he can put the genie back in the bottle and appeal to some of the kind of moral middle class voters that have been lost from the Liberal Party.
I was also really interested, I guess, in, as you said, that he doesn't identify with those elements of the Liberal Party, and there is that very strong anti-elite kind of message and anti-inner city latte sipping lefties kind of rhetoric. He describes himself as not a career politician, but I was really interested in how early on in his life he did run for Parliament, even if he wasn't successful, and some of the other things that people might not necessarily know about him. So Scott Morrison obviously did a good job of rebranding himself as like the daggy dad. Peter Dutton is, anti-elites, but also, has a multi-million-dollar property portfolio. I think in here you talk about that his wife bought a shopping centre that he forgot to declare because obviously you just forget about things like that. There's some real contradictions there, I guess.
Yeah. So, and this is a I would also say an extension to that Howard Battler discourse. Another reason that he encapsulates that so well is that a lot of so-called Howard Battlers became incredibly wealthy, and a large part of that was due to the changes that John Howard made in terms of the loopholes around negative gearing and capital gains. So Dutton, while presenting as like anti-elite, he's a incredibly wealthy. He's been in politics for a long time now. He ran for state parliament when he was 19. He's got really strong political aspirations dating back to before he was a police officer, before his experiences in the police force. So there is that contradiction, and kind of it goes to this broader debate within Australian politics now, where anyone with a slightly progressive perspective is painted as an elite, often by people who with coming from positions of incredible wealth and power. And so it becomes, it's very hard to ever have a proper debate or conversation about anything, because and you get to this point where, like we saw during the Voice debate, anyone who was pro-voice, including Indigenous activists who had come from incredibly humble means, were suddenly all painted as like inner city elites. And it kind of, I think it really poisoned the nature of the debate, because I think it's one thing to have, questions or critiques about certain policies or positions, but to simply just dismiss people out of hand as being part of this kind of like conspiracy of elites and putting them in the same bracket as Alan Joyce, for example, it just doesn't lead to any kind of quality of public debate.
I'm also really interested in some of the elements that you talked about in terms of, his experiences in Parliament, not only in going for the leadership, but kind of how he has wielded power. And there's two things I want to kind of talk about. You have a quote in here, or like you've said in the essay, for John Howard, punishment was a means to power, and for Dutton, power is a means to punishment. And I guess I kind of want to link that to some of the things that you talked about in terms of the power that he concentrated in home affairs and some of those controversial programs and things that he was responsible for as minister.
Yeah, and I think the distinction there I made was sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier about Howard was someone with who was driven into politics by a very kind of like single-minded economic vision. And I think that he, while having certainly socially conservative views, he was more of an opportunist around, say, asylum seekers. It's an issue that presented itself, and he used it to further his own economic vision for the country. Whereas I think because of Dutton's experiences throughout the 90s, he entered politics not as someone with a really single-minded economic vision for the country, but he was really driven by the fact that he thought that too many criminals were getting weak sentences, and he wanted to be in politics to provide the perspective of a police officer. And that's like an explicit reason for why he entered politics. So there is this sense of like crime and punishment, which I think is a lot bigger deal for Dutton than it was for John Howard, even if John Howard exploited those debates and conversations. And then when you have someone like that rising through power, who doesn't have any fear, and in fact actually thrives on punishment because it provokes a response from progressives and from the people that he sees as social justice warriors in terms of refugee advocates. He sort of thrives on that kind of conflict, and it allows him to rise to this position. And then we've all seen over the past few years, it's kind of been like a steady stream of revelations about what was actually happening in home affairs. And so it's not just a moral argument about what are we doing to these people on islands off the coast of Australia. It's also about his ability to administer programs, which is a primary job of politicians. And there's not really any evidence at all that he was good at the introduction of programs or the management of programs. And in fact, when you see what he was doing at the same time as running home affairs, you get you get a picture that he was much more preoccupied with how he was going to climb to the top of the Liberal Party, and that he was quite good at he was very good, in fact, at that internal politics and the kind of cultivation of connections with conservative commentators and power brokers, but not very good at what he was claiming, which was that he was protecting Australia, and that we, in fact, while we had this single-minded vision on stopping the boats, we had all sorts of issues around the kinds of people who were coming into Australia and people who were being mistreated, vulnerable people who were being mistreated because there wasn't the kind of oversight that was needed. So there was this kind of tunnel vision on punishment rather than the actual like running a productive and effective immigration program.
And I was really interested to read about some of the things that he did in home affairs, including the proposed stripping of citizenship from terrorism suspects, not just terrorists, but just suspects, that you kind of talk about that even Barnaby Joyce was kind of gobsmacked by that proposal and being controversial. But it does...
There was actually quite a few moments... Oh, I was going to say, there was actually quite a few moments throughout my research, and I had to cut a few of them, where Barnaby Joyce was like going right back to the start of Dutton's career, where Barnaby Joyce would often be kind of like a voice of reason, whether it was like cutting entitlements for single mothers. And yeah, there was a few times where Dutton was going really hard on these issues, and Barnaby Joyce was actually the voice of reason, saying, "Oh, that's a bit hectic, isn't it?" Like, yeah. So it's that I think that says something about how kind of like gung ho Dutton was on a bunch of those issues.
And I guess during all of those leadership tensions, another thing that kind of, I mean, obviously he's opposition leader now, but that came out, he was really good at doing some of that internal politics, but in the end, it wasn't enough to get him over the line when Scott Morrison became leader. Sorry, I've got something in my eye here.
Oh, all good.
So, he famously couldn't do the numbers and didn't get that position when Scott Morrison went on to become the leader.
Yeah.
But he's set up there now. Looking ahead, how do you think it's looking for him going into the next election? What are some of the key challenges going to be for him?
Yeah, like there's extreme challenges, like in terms of the structural issues facing the Liberal Party, and how do you? And this goes to the suburban strategy, because one of the reasons why it's kind of like a tantalising idea or thesis is because it will be extremely hard for the Liberal Party to appeal to seats that they lost to the Teals, and also to outer suburban, sort of more socially conservative seats and regional seats. It's a very hard thing to walk both those lines in a single election, and I think that's why we've seen the Liberal Party kind of prioritise those more outer suburban regional seats. But yeah, it's very hard to see them getting a majority at the next election, which is why I think a lot of analysts have kind of opined that he is pursuing kind of like a two-term strategy, that the main game is to drive Labor into minority government at the next election, and then to keep cultivating a sense of chaos, and then coming up at that second election and winning it. And I think, I don't write off the kind of certain political skills that Dutton has. Like I kind of look at them in the essay, and I don't think I underestimate him as a politician. But yeah, it's incredibly, the comparison would be made again with Abbott driving Gillard into minority government and then beating Rudd at the 2013 election. But Abbott became opposition leader at the end of 2009, so he didn't serve a full 6 years as opposition leader. It would be, I think that the last opposition leader who served 2 full terms might have actually been Whitlam. Like in terms of like consecutively, like I think it's not really the done thing anymore. Like it used to be, you would serve an apprenticeship as an opposition leader and then eventually possibly become prime minister. In more recent history, they're often quite recent. Like if you look at Rudd, for example, he became opposition leader, I think, like roughly a year before he became prime minister. So it would be a colossal task for him to win in a single term. And then even if he was able to drive Labor into minority government, it would be a colossal ask for him to last until the following election after that. So I think it's like a really, objectively speaking, really challenging to see a path to power for him. But that doesn't mean, and I think that's the other thing that the essay does, is that it says, like, don't underestimate Dutton as a politician, and also that he doesn't need to become the prime minister to have like a really tangible effect on Australian politics and on the kind of debates that we're having, and on the in terms of he doesn't need to win the next election to have like a really serious impact, and to keep Australian politics stuck in a place where it's probably been for 25, 26 years. Like him being the opposition leader, and in some ways on certain issues being a quite effective opposition leader, will keep Australia stuck in a previous epoch.
Yeah. I'm going to go to questions from the audience soon. I can see we've got 540 people on the line with us today. Thanks.
Oh, that's awesome.
At Australia's Biggest Book Club. We'll send the video recording to people to catch up later. For those who didn't join us, more than 1,000 people registered for today. So huge interest in this essay for sure. I did want to go now to those questions. Just a reminder that you can put your questions in the Q&A box, and you can upvote other people's questions and leave comments as well. The first question is from Deb Campbell, and she asks, how much do you think Dutton's contempt is being fostered by Murdoch to encourage the breakdown of a comfortable two-party consensus? and encourage extreme partisanship like we've seen with Trump in the United States?
Yeah, I think that there's, in terms of Dutton's career and the way that he's tied himself very closely to the kind of right-wing media, and that's that's like his comfort zone. And I think that also goes to the issue for the Liberal Party is that, it's not just a political system that is facing like massive issues in terms of the evaporation of the social basis for both major parties, but it's also the newspaper industry and the news industry in general. Like people, I'm not sure that say any newspaper company has the same level of influence as what they did 25 years ago. So it's kind of I think, outdated way of thinking if you're talking about how you're going to engage with millennial voters and under, which is a massive issue for conservative politics. To kind of, I think that, yeah, you need to come up with new ways of appealing to those people. You simply use the old forms. And so, and the other thing I would say about the Trump comparison is that Australia has like a kind of very different geography. Like in some ways, Australia and America are big countries, and there are some similarities in the sense that they're both, settler states, but they're very different, like demographically, and they're very like they have different political systems. So this is something that Abbott has spoken about in terms of recreating the Trump plan and going for the flyover states. Well, Australia doesn't have, it doesn't have this like glut of rust belts in the middle of Australia with all these Labor voting seats. Like if you go outside of the cities in Australia, most of them already vote conservatively. So there's not like that kind of game plan doesn't really, you can't just naturally recreate it in Australia. It's a very different place. And so I think we get a lot of those cultural issues being imported from overseas, and sometimes they can have an effect, but they don't fit as neatly into Australia's political system as they do in America.
Mm. The next question that I've got is from Liam Holcomb, who asks, or who says, I live in your old hometown of Toowoomba. Our electorate of Groom is one of the safest in the country for the LNP. Last election saw a serious challenge from a Teal who came close. His question is, do you think the LNP are underestimating the move towards the Teals when even a seat like Groom, they're managing to shake things up?
Yeah, that was like, thanks for the question. That was fascinating, the result in Groom. And I think that it's, like, because I grew up in Toowoomba, I've lived there. I lived there again in my mid-20s. It is sort of seen as being like Australia's Bible Belt and a really conservative place. But a lot of these regional cities are kind of like changing significantly. You've got more people coming back from the city. It's cheaper, so people are moving back there to raise their kids. I don't think it's as easy to just pigeonhole them. It would be, it would be a massive ask to see a seat like Groom fall to an independent. But I think that there is, as we've seen with some of the country independents, there is an appetite in regional Australia for serious politicians who are addressing serious issues. And I think that, this move towards more independence, it's something that I think also provides a threat to the Labor Party, and that there's, the people kind of want authentic representation, and they don't necessarily feel like they're getting it from the major parties.
It's a really interesting observation because, I think that's probably a bigger threat to the Labor Party in the next election. And there's also the phenomenon, I guess, of small and minor parties and micro parties as well. There is that real trend against both the major parties over a long period of time. And once those independents are in, they're often really hard to shift out again. So, really interesting dynamics there. The next question I've got is from Dr. Lee Anderson, who says, you wrote that Dutton is small and scared. What is he scared of?
I think Dutton is genuinely afraid of change in a way that, like we've seen a lot of these debates are similar to what we've been having in Australia for quite a long time. I think that Dutton is more emotionally driven by a fear of change than even, some of the conservative leaders we've seen recently. And that goes to his psychology, and that goes to the kind of his background. And I think that he is, even though he doesn't present as someone who's particularly emotional, he is really driven around quite like visceral emotions about, foreigners and minorities. And I think if you go back through his history, you start to understand why that is, because there's very particular cases that he dealt with. And that's, I think, filtered throughout his political career.
Mm. The next one that I've got is about some of his performances as a minister. So Jim Knox is asking about biosecurity controls, and seldom discuss just how much the coalition dropped the ball in this respect. Can you comment or elaborate on some of those deficiencies in the way that he was managing his responsibilities as a minister?
As a Home Affairs Minister?
I'm not sure if it's specific to Home Affairs there or one of his earlier ones, but sorry. This one was talking about border security, I guess, and some of that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, so that goes to that idea about the implementation of programs and like public administration. It's something that Dutton hasn't really demonstrated a great knack for. I think that if you look at the migration program and the kind of like backlog of issues that are being dealt with now, like it's one thing to present yourself as a strong man and that you're willing to do the hard things and the tough things, and but then when you actually analyze the gap between like rhetoric and action and service delivery, like it's a very complicated space to be in, and often it requires more subtlety and nuance than I think he's shown in certain cases.
The next question that I've got is from someone who's kind of asking about those points that you were making, that he doesn't really have a strong case on the economy and doesn't necessarily feel comfortable operating in that space. And the observation about a kind of a younger electorate, and they haven't asked about this, but I'm going to. You quote a former Liberal strategist, Tony Barry, in there about some of the demographic shifts that are coming down the pipeline kind of by 2040, and in particular housing, you kind of talk about as a key issue that they're going to have to grapple with there. I wonder if you can just expand a little on some of those challenges, not only for Dutton, I guess, but for all political parties coming down the pipeline.
Yeah, I think it's a big issue for all political parties, and this is why I think, like, retracing Dutton's history in terms of property investment and when the way that he profited from Howard's changes in those areas, and when he entered politics, and he has like a real emotional attachment, I think, to that period, and he feels, I think, slighted by the idea that he's not that he didn't earn his money in a legitimate way. And I make the point in the essay that Howard's changes were actually quite good for, there's a lot of working class and lower middle class people who did really well out of the property market, but it's like, what are you going to offer to the next generation of like battlers? Like if they can't afford to buy a house, where is their loyalty going to come from? And so that's something that will like affect all of Australian politics, but I think that it will also have it'll have a particular be a particular issue for the Liberals, because I think that they're associated with landlords in a way that even, say, Labor isn't. Although I think that Labor is really vulnerable to the kind of debates that we've seen emerge over the past year. And I think that the Greens are having some making real inroads with younger voters based on housing and based on inequality. So how both of those major parties respond to that is going to be fascinating to watch, because the reality is that the majority of adults still own properties in Australia, and they don't. Most of them don't want to see especially if they've got a big mortgage, they don't want to see the value of their home go down. So how do you institute major change in these areas without alienating the majority? And that's something that I think why Australian politics are still sort of stuck without being able to have any major vision in that area, because people have it's not pure selfishness if you've bought a house and you're trying to pay a mortgage which is ballooning to want it to remain at a higher price. Like it's not just kind of property investors who have an incentive for the property prices to keep on going up, but how do you balance that against millennials and under who can't enter the property market or are stuck in the rental market and paying inflated prices constantly? And that's building up a massive sense of grievance, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And Richard Dennis, our executive director, has looked in the past at like the legacy of Menzies in the Liberal Party was really, he saw housing as giving, like he wanted it accessible to as many people as possible because he thought it kind of gave them a stake in society and the community, and, it would link them to a specific area. He really kind of came at it from that conservative point of view, which has really been kind of flipped on its head to, as you said, kind of that landlord's class. I've got a question at the top there, and you haven't covered this in the essay, but just noting the controversial comments today where Bridget Archer has kind of criticised Peter Dutton's comparison in a speech of basically the Port Arthur massacre and the murder of 35 people with a pro-Palestinian protest at the Opera House. The question from Jennifer Manson is, why is Dutton so anti-Palestinian? I know you haven't covered this in the essay, but could you perhaps maybe put that into context about what you've learned from him in this essay?
Well, I do cover it in the stretch about the debate around immigration detention, and when Dutton was kind of latching onto the potential arrival of Palestinian refugees.
That's right. Sorry.
And demonizing them and saying that, and like that's like a common theme throughout his career. But there's this kind of like, it's been building up for a while, but this, we've seen it with Trump, people who you wouldn't necessarily think as being like particularly tied to Israel, like they've got this immense loyalty to them. And I think politically for Dutton, he sees it as like a immaculate wedge for the Labor Party, because the Labor Party has, seats with large in Western Sydney, for example, with large Arab communities, and then they have seats that are held by Jewish MPs, and they've got to try and walk the road between those two things. And so the harder that Dutton goes on this issue, he doesn't see any, the morality of it is like is a different thing. But like politically, he doesn't really see any downside because he's not trying to balance those constituencies. This is like happens all the time in terms of the wedges. It's like the harder he goes, the weaker Labor's response seems, because they're trying to walk the road between different groups, and the more angry both those groups are actually towards the Labor Party, because they feel like the Labor Party is not really authentically representing them. And so I think that the Conservatives have been doing this for a long time. And then I think there's also just like a knee-jerk conservatism to his response, and the way that it kind of like, I don't think I've ever heard Dutton talking about Islamophobia, and certainly throughout his career, he's been tied to the idea that he's going to protect Australia and Australians from Islamic terrorism. And so it's kind of like emotionally and politically, it just feeds into all of his base instincts. And that's why we're seeing, I think, just like a complete lack of nuance in the way that he approaches the issue.
Yeah. And you kind of talked about some of his responses following example, the Christchurch massacre, which was now's not the time to talk about Islamophobia kind of a response, if I recall correctly. The next question that I've got is from James Thompson, who asks, how would you rate Peter Dutton's commitment to democracy? Is he a genuine conservative in this sense? Or are we going into territory like we were talking about earlier with the overreach that even Barnaby Joyce objects to?
I think that's like been and I didn't want to get too philosophical in the essay because it's kind of like a narrative. And so I had to cut back a little bit on the contemplation of like what it actually means to be a conservative now, because in a philosophical sense, like social democracy is kind of like can be a fairly conservative position, especially in a Australian context, in the preservation of public institutions and public funding and all that sort of thing. And so neoliberalism was never a particularly conservative idea. Like, it might have espoused some conservative positions, but it was kind of like fairly radical. And so when you have and then if you look at it from the position of like protecting institutions, I don't think that Dutton is someone that, believes innately in the preservation of public institutions. And in fact, he's often attacked those great public institutions, whether it's judiciary, whether it's the public service, whether it's, the ABC, for example. So if in a purely philosophical sense, I don't think that I don't think that he shows much evidence of, true conservatism. And that was something that, Malcolm Turnbull certainly kind of joked about, that a lot of conservative liberals don't know the difference between Tony Burke and Edmund Burke.
The next question is from Jane Mullen, who asks, how do you think Dutton is viewed by Australian women, and does your research reveal any information on that?
Well, it'll, like, the proof will be in the pudding in terms of the seats. Like, my projection is that he doesn't naturally appeal to especially professional women. And I think that is the area where the Liberal Party has shed a lot of votes. And I think there's lots of instances where he has gone harder for female politicians than what he would male politicians. There's lots of examples, like, going back throughout his career, where women, who are suffering from illness or who have disabilities, where he's really gone for the jugular. But as I said earlier, like, the average member of the general public isn't walking around with a forensic history of Peter Dutton's actions in their heads. So that'll be decided at it'll be decided at an election about how well he can appeal to them. But I think that there are much broader issues for the Liberal Party in terms of actually retaining and introducing women into the mix, and women who, like, if you look at a lot of these, the Teal candidates and stuff, like, you kind of just shake your head, because you're like, how is Allegra Spender not a Liberal MP? And I don't say that in a pejorative sense. She's whether you agree with her politics or not, like, she's a very sensible, kind of serious person who addresses a lot of the issues that the Liberal Party has demographically, and yet she had to run as an independent to get into Parliament. Like, it kind of boggles the mind that she wasn't being headhunted by the Liberal Party. And in fact, all those seats that they lost to the Teals were held by men who had gotten safe seats. So it's like, and it seems like in some ways that the loss of those moderates is actually leading the Liberal Party to double down in certain pre-selections. So yeah, it's pretty, like, more broadly, how do they reconnect with professional women? It's pretty tough to see them doing it in the short term.
Yeah, we actually crunched the numbers on that on female representation in the parliament across the parties, and it's actually proportionally gone up in the Liberal Party, the number of women, but only because so many blokes lost their seats at the last one. Along those lines, the next question is from Anna Rose, who asks, if Dutton loses the next election and resigns as leader, who do you think is the most likely successor as the leader of the Liberal Party?
That'll be that would be fascinating. And I think that the fact that Frydenberg isn't running, or seemingly not running at the next election, they've done a pre-selection for his old seat, and he decided not to put his hat into the ring. So he would have been the most obvious one if he had been able to win that seat back. The next kind of rung of senior leaders, they've got Angus Taylor, Susan Ley, Dan Tien. So and they all represent seats that are more kind of provincial even than Dutton's seat of Dixon. So that doesn't really address their issue in the metropolitan seats. Andrew Hastie's kind of the next, he is within the same vein of conservatism as Dutton, but he's probably a bit more presentable, and he's a bit more, he's kind of looks and sounds the part. But it'll be interesting to watch him try to develop his public persona, because that's another issue I think for this next generation of conservatives, is that they don't spend a lot of time speaking with media organizations or people that they see as hostile, and so they don't get a lot of training in terms of actually having those debates. And so when you get into the position of, say, opposition leader, and the entry level is a lot higher, because people actually do want you to be able to engage in serious debate. So it'll be interesting to see, if Dutton was to lose the election, whether he survives, and B, who potentially replaces him, and whether they can address these large scale issues, because there's not really anyone, and I think that's why Dutton's fairly safe, because there's not really any obvious option who is going to immediately improve their electoral position.
Yeah. And then I think this might be the final question, but I think in a similar vein, Tara Ward says Dutton is seen as a negative politician who says no automatically to everything that Labor puts forward, and that Australians don't like negative political campaigns. Will this negative strategy lose him the next election?
I would say Australians say that they don't like negative politics, but they often reward extremely negative politics. And we saw in 2016 with the idea that Turnbull was going to run a more positive campaign, and then nearly lost to Shorten. And then we saw a really negative campaign against Shorten in 2019, which was really successful. And there's been lots of examples on for both parties where you have a lot of success with negative campaigns. I think that the issue for Dutton is that in opposition leaders, I think that Australians like when opposition leaders can demonstrate that they're kind of they do something unexpected, where you're and Rudd would do this a lot, where he would adopt positions that were closer to Howard and kind of do things that would really annoy his base. Whereas I haven't really seen, and that's a kind of classic thing for an opposition leader to do. They annoy their base and kind of demonstrate to people who voted for the other party at the last election that they're not ideological and that they're kind of pragmatic. And I haven't really seen any evidence of Dutton being willing to kind of irritate his base. And so I think that idea that he's kind of he might need to kind of save his negativity for more isolated moments, whereas when it's just constant, people start to take you less seriously, because it just you become desensitized to the negativity. And then when you actually are trying to make a serious point, they're not taking you seriously because they think that you're always just saying no.
Yeah. I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up there, but I do highly recommend getting yourself a copy of the latest quarterly essay, Bad Cop, by Lech Blaine, who's joined us today. Thank you so much for joining us, Lech. We've really appreciated digging into your essay. It's fantastic. And I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of what's in there too, because there's loads of things. We didn't even get into the voice or too much into leadership. And
it's been awesome. It's been awesome. Thank you so much for having me. And thanks everyone for jumping online and watching. I really appreciate it. And thanks for all the wonderful, enriching questions, which have made me kind of like think about my own thoughts more. And then it's been awesome.
Thank you so much. As I mentioned, it's available in all good bookshops and newsagents right now. There's an extract on our website if you'd like to check that out. And just a reminder that next month we'll be talking to Bree Lee for Australia's Biggest Book Club. That's on Tuesday, the 7th of May at 11 a.m. about her new fiction novel, The Work. And make sure you're subscribed to our podcast, Follow the Money, and Greg Jericho's new podcast, Dollars and Cents. You can find those wherever you normally listen to podcasts. And head on over to the Australia Institute website and make sure you subscribe to our newsletter as well. That's how you can find out about upcoming webinars coming and events coming near you. Thanks so much, everyone. And thanks again, Lech. We'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. Catch us later.
Thanks for watching. Visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research, commentary and analysis, as well as details for upcoming events and webinars.